By May 1940, the world was watching in stunned silence as the German Wehrmacht performed what seemed like a military miracle. The Blitzkrieg had shattered the Allied lines, bypassed the impenetrable Maginot Line, and was now racing toward the English Channel. To the German soldiers, and indeed to Adolf Hitler himself, the war felt already won. They were the masters of modern warfare, a mechanized juggernaut that no one could stop. Their tanks were fast, their communication was perfect, and their confidence had crossed the line into dangerous arrogance. They viewed the British Expeditionary Force and the French Army not as rivals, but as remnants of a bygone era, slow, disorganized, and destined for the scrap heap of history. This sense of superiority was intoxicating. It led them to push forward with reckless speed, leaving their flanks exposed and their supply lines thin. They believed they were hunting sheep, never suspecting that in the small, dusty town of Arras, the sheep were about to grow iron teeth. This was the peak of German pride, right before the moment it collided with a reality they weren't prepared to handle.
The backbone of German anti-tank defense in 1940 was the Pak-36, a 37mm gun that had performed brilliantly during the invasion of Poland. The German crews loved it. It was light, easy to hide, and fast to fire. They nicknamed it their reliable shield. But there was a dark joke brewing among the veteran artillerymen that the high command ignored. They called the Pak-36 the Heers Aanklopfgerät, the Army's door knocker. Against light French tanks and armored cars, it was lethal, but as the panzers pushed deeper into France, the German generals ignored the intelligence reports about British heavy tanks. They were so convinced of their own tactical genius that they assumed their light guns would suffice for any encounter. This technological arrogance was about to become a death sentence. Thousands of German soldiers were heading into battle protected by a gun that was essentially a toy against what was waiting for them behind the hills of Arras. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to bring a knife to a gunfight, and the door knocker was about to find a door it couldn't even scratch. While the German panzers were built for speed and maneuverability, the British had a different philosophy: the infantry tank. Enter the Matilda II. It was a slow, lumbering beast, barely reaching a walking pace, but it possessed something the Germans hadn't encountered yet: 78mm of solid steel armor. In 1940, this was practically a rolling fortress. The Matilda was designed to walk alongside infantry through a hail of fire, ignoring everything the enemy threw at it. As the British Expeditionary Force retreated toward Dunkirk, a small, improvised force of these iron giants was gathered for a desperate counterattack. The British crews knew they were outnumbered and outgunned in terms of speed, but they had faith in their thick skin. These men were the underdogs, the forgotten rear guard of a collapsing front. But as they buttoned down their hatches and began the slow crawl toward the German flank at Arras, they carried the weight of the entire Allied cause. They weren't looking for a graceful maneuver. They were coming to deliver a blunt force trauma to the German ego.
Leading the German spearhead near Arras was none other than Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox in the making. At this stage, he was the commander of the 7th Panzer Division, famously known as the Ghost Division, because even the German high command often didn't know where they were. Rommel was a master of the daring strike, always pushing his men to the limit of their endurance. He had bypassed Arras, leaving only his rear elements and SS motorized units to guard his flank. In his arrogance, he believed the British were too busy fleeing for the coast to even think about a counterattack. He had stretched his division thin, gambling that speed would compensate for a lack of security. It was a classic Rommel move, brilliant if it worked, but catastrophic if the enemy showed any spine. On the morning of May 21st, Rommel was miles ahead of his support, leaving his supply columns and anti-tank units vulnerable. He had created a vacuum, and into that vacuum, the British Matildas were about to descend like a hammer.
The attack began in the afternoon. 2 columns of British tanks, supported by infantry, slammed into the flank of the 7th Panzer Division and the SS Totenkopf Division. The initial contact was pure chaos. The German rear guard, mostly motorized infantry and light anti-tank crews, were caught completely off guard. They hadn't seen a British tank in days, and certainly not one this large. The air was suddenly filled with the roar of engines and the whistle of shells. German officers tried to organize a defense, screaming orders over the din of battle, but the speed of the British onset, despite the slow pace of the tanks, created a shock effect. Trucks were overturned, fuel lines were severed, and the German soldiers, who had been laughing and singing only an hour before, found themselves in a desperate fight for survival. This was the first time in the campaign that the Germans weren't the ones dictating the pace. The privateer had become the prey, and the psychological impact was immediate. The word counterattack rippled through the German lines, turning their confident advance into a disorganized scramble for cover.
This is the moment the legend of the invincible Wehrmacht began to crack. German Pak-36 crews, trained to believe their guns could destroy anything, took aim at the approaching Matildas. They fired at point-blank range, 1 hit, 2 hits, 5 hits. The German gunners watched in horror as their shells simply sparked and ricocheted off the British armor like pebbles thrown at a wall. The Matildas didn't even slow down. They continued their slow, rhythmic advance, their machine guns spitting lead, crushing German equipment under their massive tracks. One German officer later wrote that it was like trying to stop a mountain with a pea shooter. The realization hit the crews like a physical blow. They were powerless. Their primary weapon was useless. Panic, a cold and infectious thing, began to spread. Gun crews abandoned their positions, realizing that staying meant certain death. The British tanks were moving through the German lines like ghosts that couldn't be killed. And for the first time in the war, German soldiers felt the terrifying sensation of being completely outmatched by superior technology. Even the fanatical soldiers of the SS Totenkampf division were not immune to the terror. As the British Matildas crashed into their positions, the SS units, who lacked the experience of the regular Wehrmacht, suffered a massive breakdown in discipline. They had been told they were the elite, the racial and military superiors of the world, but as they watched their shells bounce off the British steel, that ideology crumbled. They broke and ran. This was a massive embarrassment for the Nazi leadership. The invincible SS was fleeing from a handful of British tanks. The British crews, seeing the enemy in retreat, pressed their advantage, even though they were low on fuel and ammunition. They realized they had struck a nerve. The German Blitz was based on the idea of constant forward motion. Once that motion was stopped, the entire system began to overheat. The sight of SS troops running in panic through the French wheat fields was a visual proof that the German machine was built on a foundation of confidence that was easily shattered by a little bit of thick steel and British grit. When word of the crisis reached Rommel, he raced back to the Arras sector. What he found was a disaster. His division was being cut in half. Rommel, usually the picture of calm brilliance, was seen by witnesses in a state of high agitation. He personally began to drag guns into position, shouting at fleeing soldiers to stand and fight. He was convinced he was being attacked by 5 British divisions, a massive exaggeration as there were actually only 2 battalions of tanks. But this tank fright was a testament to the effectiveness of the British counterstroke. Rommel's own staff were terrified. They believed they were about to be surrounded and destroyed. The Desert Fox was learning a hard lesson. A spearhead is only as strong as its base. For several hours, Rommel was no longer the hunter. He was a desperate man trying to plug a hole in a dam that was about to burst. This moment at Arras would haunt Rommel for years. It was the one time the British had truly gotten under his skin and made him fear that the entire French campaign might collapse in a single afternoon. In his desperation to stop the Matildas, Rommel turned to a weapon that wasn't supposed to be used against tanks, the 88mm flak gun. Originally designed to shoot down high-flying bombers, the 88 possessed a massive muzzle velocity and a heavy shell. Rommel ordered his flak crews to ignore the sky and aim directly at the British armor. This was a pivotal moment in military history. As the Matildas approached, the 88s roared to life. Unlike the door knockers, these shells didn't bounce. The first Matilda was hit and exploded in a ball of fire, then another. The massive power of the 88mm finally cracked the British shells that the rest of the German army couldn't touch. But the fact that Rommel had to use his anti-aircraft guns as a last-ditch defense was proof of how close the British had come to a total breakthrough. The 88 saved the German army that day, but it was a victory born of absolute panic. It was a makeshift solution to a crisis caused by a deep and systemic underestimation of the enemy.
The ripples of the Battle of Arras reached all the way to Hitler's headquarters at the Wolf's Lair. When Hitler heard that British heavy tanks had nearly sliced through Rommel's division, he was seized by a familiar demon: fear. He had always been nervous about the speed of the advance, and Arras confirmed his worst nightmare, that the panzers would be cut off and destroyed. This tank fright led to one of the most controversial decisions of the war, the halt order. Hitler, backed by some of his more conservative generals, ordered the panzers to stop their advance on Dunkirk for 48 hours to consolidate their lines. Those 48 hours were the miracle the British needed. It allowed them to build the perimeter that would eventually lead to the evacuation of over 300,000 troops. The cardboard tank trap at Arras didn't win the battle, but it scared the German high command so badly that it arguably saved the British army from total annihilation. A handful of Matildas had managed to plant a seed of doubt in the mind of the dictator, a seed that would eventually grow into the disaster of the later war years. As the sun set over Arras on May 21, 1940, the immediate threat to the German flank had been neutralized, but the atmosphere in the German camp was far from celebratory. The fields were littered with the charred remains of their transport columns and the broken shells of the British Matildas. For the first time, German salvage crews were inspecting enemy tanks that they couldn't penetrate with standard-issue weapons. They counted the indentations on the Matilda's armor, dozens of non-penetrating hits from their 37mm guns. It was a sobering sight. The German victory had been a near-run thing, saved only by the desperate improvised use of anti-aircraft guns. The High Command tried to spin the battle as a minor skirmish, but the soldiers who had been there knew better. They had seen the invincible Blitzkrieg grind to a halt against a handful of determined men in thick steel boxes. The psychological cost was high. The sense of total invulnerability that had fueled the drive through France was gone, replaced by a nagging realization that the decadent British were still a force to be feared.
Out of the chaos of Arras, a new legend was born that would haunt Allied tankers for the rest of the war: the 88mm flak gun as a tank killer. Before Arras, using the 88 against ground targets was seen as a desperate, almost improper use of a specialized high-altitude weapon. But Rommel's frantic order had proven its devastating effectiveness. The 88 didn't just stop the Matildas, it obliterated them. From that day forward, the German military changed its doctrine. The 88 was no longer just for the sky. It became the ultimate insurance policy against heavy armor. For the Allies, the 88 became a word of terror, a weapon that could strike from miles away with pinpoint accuracy. However, this success also reinforced a dangerous German habit, relying on individual wonder weapons to fix systemic tactical failures. Arras showed them they lacked a standard anti-tank gun, but instead of fixing the 37mm door knocker immediately, they felt they could simply lean on the 88 to bail them out of any future crisis. It was a temporary fix for a permanent problem. The true impact of the Battle of Arras wasn't measured in destroyed tanks, but in time. Because of the panic the Matildas caused, the halt order stood. As the German panzers sat idle just miles from the coast, the British Expeditionary Force began the impossible, Operation Dynamo.
While Hitler and his generals argued about the safety of their flanks, the little ships were crossing the channel. The 48-hour delay bought by the sacrifice of the British tank crews at Arras allowed the Allies to solidify the Dunkirk perimeter. Had Rommel and the other panzer commanders not been shaken by the tank fright at Arras, they likely would have reached the coast before the evacuation even began. Over 330,000 soldiers were saved, providing the core of the army that would eventually return to Normandy 4 years later. The men who died in the cardboard tank trap had essentially traded their lives for the survival of the British Army. Arras was a tactical defeat that became a strategic miracle, proving that a single day of unexpected resistance can change the entire course of a world war. History is often a story of lessons ignored. Following the fall of France, the German High Command analyzed the Arras counterattack. Instead of seeing it as a warning that their tank armor and anti-tank guns were insufficient, they chose to see it as a fluke, a desperate move by a dying enemy. Their arrogance returned with a vengeance. When they began planning Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, they convinced themselves that Soviet tanks would be even worse than the French and British models. They continued to produce the Panzer III with its light armor and the Pak-36 door knocker as their primary weapons. They ignored the reports from Arras that thick armor could stop their Blitzkrieg cold. This was a fatal mistake. They were heading toward a collision with the Soviet T-34 and the KV-1, tanks that would make the Matilda look like a toy. By failing to take the Matilda shock seriously, the German leadership ensured that when they finally hit the Russian Iron Wall, the disaster would be total. The arrogance of 1940 was paving the way for the slaughter of 1941.
The Battle of Arras introduced a new term to the German military vocabulary: Panzer Angst, or tank fright. It was the realization that your weapons might be useless against a steel monster that is slowly, unstoppably crawling toward you. This psychological trauma never truly left the German infantry. Even as they won victory after victory in the early stages of the war, the memory of the Matildas at Arras lingered like a ghost. It made German commanders cautious where they should have been bold. It made them obsessive about developing heavier and heavier tanks like the Tiger and the Panther, leading to over-engineered monsters that were prone to mechanical failure. The cardboard tank trap had exposed a vulnerability in the German psyche. They were brilliant when winning, but they struggled with the unexpected. Arras was the first time they felt the friction of war, the moment where plans fail and the enemy refuses to follow the script. This mental crack would widen over the years until it eventually became a canyon.
Technologically, Arras proved that the era of the light panzer was over. The Panzer I and II, which made up the bulk of the German forces in 1940, were essentially armored cars with machine guns. They were useless against real tanks. Even the Panzer III was struggling. The German industrial machine was now in a race it hadn't prepared for. They needed bigger guns and thicker steel, but their factories were still optimized for the Blitzkrieg models. This delay in upgrading their hardware would prove costly. While the British began developing the 6-pounder and 17-pounder guns after their experience at Arras, the Germans remained overconfident in their existing arsenal. Arras was a flashing red light on the dashboard of the Third Reich, warning them that their industrial superiority was an illusion. They chose to ignore the light, believing that their superior spirit would always overcome the enemy's superior steel. It was a delusion that would work until it met the industrial might of the Soviet Union and the United States.
In his official reports and later in his personal writings, Erwin Rommel was careful about how he described the Battle of Arras. He admitted to the crisis, but he framed it as a moment where his personal intervention saved the day. He downplayed the panic of the SS units and focused on the success of the 88mm guns. By doing so, he helped create the very myth of German invincibility that Arras had nearly destroyed. Rommel became a superstar, the desert fox, but the lessons of Arras, the vulnerability of his flanks, and the inadequacy of his guns were buried under his growing legend. He continued to lead with the same reckless speed in North Africa, often outrunning his supplies and exposing his rear. The Arras gamble had worked once, so Rommel assumed it would always work. He had learned how to win a battle with a door knocker and an 88, but he hadn't learned the danger of underestimating his opponent's resolve. His brilliance was undeniable, but it was often a mask for the systemic flaws that Arras had briefly brought to light. 1 year later, on the plains of Russia, the nightmare of Arras returned with terrifying scale. German Pak-36 crews fired at the new Soviet T-34s and KV-1s, only to see their shells bounce off once again. The door knocker had returned to haunt them. The panic that had seized the SS Totenkopf at Arras now seized entire divisions in the east. The Germans were forced to realize that the cardboard tank trap wasn't a fluke, it was the future of warfare. They were now in a war where thick skin mattered more than Blitzkrieg speed. The Matildas of Arras had been the ancestors of the monsters they now faced in the Soviet Union. Had they taken Arras as a sign to completely rearm in 1940, the war in the East might have looked very different. Instead, they were playing catch-up in a frozen wasteland, paying for their 1940 arrogance with the lives of millions of soldiers. The ghost of Arras had finally caught up with the Wehrmacht, and this time, there were no little ships to save anyone. The Battle of Arras shattered the myth that the Blitzkrieg was an unstoppable force of nature. It proved that it was a fragile system, dependent on the enemy's confusion and lack of armor. Once the enemy stood their ground and used heavy steel, the German machine faltered. Arras was the first chapter in the long story of the Allied realization that the supermen were just men and their tanks were just machines. The cardboard tank trap showed that even in the midst of a total collapse, a small, well-armored force could strike a blow that echoed through the highest levels of command. It was a lesson in the power of the defensive in a world obsessed with the offensive. The German High Command never fully recovered from the suspicion that at any moment a Matilda could emerge from the fog and end their dream of empire. Arras was the moment the Blitzkrieg lost its soul, leaving behind only a machine that was increasingly outmatched by the very enemies it had once despised. Today, the fields around Arras are silent, the craters filled and the grass green, but the rusted relics of the Matildas occasionally found in the soil remain as iron mirrors, reflecting a time when a few British tank crews changed history. They didn't win the Battle of France, but they won the time needed for the war to continue. They exposed the arrogance of a conqueror and saved an army from destruction. The cardboard tank trap is a reminder that in war, underestimating your enemy is the shortest path to disaster. The German panzers raced toward the Channel, thinking they had won, unaware that the seeds of their final defeat in 1945 were sown in the panic of a Tuesday afternoon in May 1940. The Blitz was fast, but the Matilda was thick, and in the long run of history, thickness of resolve often outlasts the speed of the strike. This has been the story of Arras, the day the Blitzkrieg trembled. This is WW2 Uncut Story. Thank you for watching.